Asyle, Tropical Island Survival. Week 31, Day 1. It's a new week, and once again, I'm starting to feel a bit nervous that I'm halfway through the month and the smugglers will probably be coming back soon. I feel like I haven't actually gotten a lot done in the way of defenses, even though I've actually done quite a lot. At least I could calm my nerves a bit in the morning after my chores by setting up and testing the hydrophone. At that point, I figured I could sacrifice 25 feet of wire to save myself a little time, resting the hydrophone in the water at the end of the cave and running the wire back to the panic room, where I hooked it up to the amplifier and filter circuits. I also had a spare piezoelectric crystal that I hooked up to the circuit as a transducer. Right away, I could hear loads of cool noises. Besides the faint lapping of waves, I could hear odd popping sounds made by fish, and even the occasional snap or thrashing of tails. Sometimes I thought I could hear the tweets and clicks of dolphins somewhere in the distance. As fun as that was, however, I spent a little time tuning it so I could only hear the low-pitched buzzing of a boat motor, for which I simply brought the hydrophone close to me and hummed into it at the pitches I expected a boat motor would make. A zinc battery to power the amplification completed the detector, and I expect I'll be able to sleep easier from now on. With that out of the way, I got back to building my rotating puzzle passage, cutting down more bamboo and building the framework of it, since the foundation underneath it was pretty much set. Unlike the rotating passage from Riven that I was emulating, however, I didn't want it to necessarily be obvious to anyone entering the passage that there were 5 exits, or anything about the passage's structure. So instead of making a rotating room with 5 alcoves, I made a narrow tunnel that turned at a 45-degree angle, before running into one of the dead-end alcoves in the surrounding framework. As a test of the wireframe turntable on myself, I saw it would take at least 3 rotations to get from the lava tube entrance to the secret escape tunnel, though as I was playing with it, I realized there was nothing stopping them from filling the passageway with 5 or 6 guys and then storming the escape tunnel, though they'd be coming from that direction in single file, so I'd only have to deal with one at a time. Another upside of the framework design was that I didn't actually have to fill the whole thing with concrete, just a shell around the passageway, and maybe a couple of doors to access the intervening space. I realized as I went that making these doors on the outside edge of the rotating passage might give someone a means to bypass the puzzle, so I put the doors on the inside of the passage itself, which only made the passage that much more confusing to navigate. It took a few hours to finish the framework, and then I stopped for lunch. Afterwards, I got my concrete materials and started filling in the framework surrounding the turntable as planned. I spent pretty much all of the remainder of the day working on that, as there was a lot of volume to fill up. Nevertheless, I tried to have a little fun with it, making the claycrete surfaces smooth, and sometimes patterned where I felt it was appropriate. I left some holes in different sections of the walls, however, so I could fill them up with liquid concrete later to make them completely solid, without which the structure will be prone to cracking and crumbling to pieces at the slightest disturbance, as it is fundamentally a facade. When I was done, I cleaned the concrete off my roughened hands and got ready for bed. Week 31, Day 2. I was startled awake early in the morning by the sound of the hydrophone buzzing. It definitely sounded like a boat motor. I climbed up to the top of my solar tower and got out my telescope, but I didn't see anything. Confused, I returned to the panic room and continued to listen. The buzzing soon grew faint. I can only assume it was just a boat passing by. My hydrophone must have a much greater range than I expected, farther than even the horizon, which kind of surprises me. As I laid back down to sleep, though, I wondered why they didn't hear my radio transmitter, and I got up to double check that, yes, it was charged and working correctly. I could hear it tapping out SOS on my radio receiver. I don't get it. Why isn't anyone coming to rescue me? This made for troubled sleep. Who knows how many other boats and planes had passed me by and just ignored my signals, and I just wasn't aware of it. It makes me feel like the rest of the world doesn't even want me around. If they can't even be bothered to listen for my signal, or they're so busy doing whatever they feel is important that they can't make a detour to come pick me up. I got up around the usual time, bleary-eyed and frankly a bit depressed as I went about my morning chores. There was, as always, only one thing I could think of doing when in a mood like this, and that was to keep myself distracted with an interesting project, namely getting back to the rotating passageway, gathering my concrete materials and filling in the walls, though with measurably less gusto than I had before. I left some gaps in the concrete around the perimeter of the framework, leaving the bamboo scaffolding exposed like the rungs of a sideways ladder. This was so that the passage could be easily turned from outside. I made sure to put similar handholds on the outside of the rotating passage, so it could be turned manually from the inside as well. The rollers made this surprisingly easy, despite the considerable weight of the concrete. I finished around lunchtime, but it hadn't really improved my mood. If anything, it just kind of gave me time to stew in my depressed thoughts, which only served to slow me down. Again, I tried to move on to something a little more fun, and started grinding some fisheye lenses, having left some holes in the walls of the passageway to look through, so I could see if anyone was coming down a passageway before turning the turntable towards it. Once the lenses were ground, I set up a little telescope system in the hollow spaces on either side of the tunnel, kind of like the ones on hotel room doors, where you can see out, but they can't see in. Naturally, the lenses took a little adjusting. Once I was done, I covered the doors in concrete to obscure what was behind them, and while I was at it, I made a locking mechanism for them, such that the intervening space can only be accessed when the chamber has been rotated to a certain angle. This involved the use of locking bars with rollers on them, and required me to do a bit of drilling into the inner and outer walls of the turntable, but the added complexity made it kind of fun, and my spirits started lifting again, now that the day and the project were coming to a close. Week 31, Day 3. I noticed the other day that I was starting to run low on journaling paper again, so although I could steal some from the blank books I had in stock, I figured it was time I started making more. On top of that, I was also aware that I had been putting off the catamaran repairs as well, and I was going to need some sail material, so as much as I wanted to continue working on the secret tunnels immediately after my morning chores, I instead decided that I needed to start making some paper and cloth today. Not that I was short on leaves and scraps from my scaffolding projects underground. I mixed up the alkali and started them grinding in the morning. Being an old hand at it by this time, it didn't take long, so while I waited for the first batch of cellulose goo to grind down, I had a look at the next thing I wanted to work on for the escape tunnel system, which was a hatch to cover the western exit. I was just starting to toy around with some ideas for it the other day, before I had my little depressive episode. But now I wanted to come back to them. The hole needed to be widened for a start, and it really needed a dedicated ladder, though I thought about using that as one more obstacle to getting in. It's probably more important, however, that I don't have any obstacles to getting out either, especially in the event that I'm cornered, in which case I can just leave the ladder lying on the floor so it's hard for anyone else to get in. And since it was already poorly supported from beneath to begin with, the hole opened pretty easily. My timer for the cellulose goo went off at that point, however, so I headed back to the workshop and set the goo spinning into thread, figuring the sails would take the most time, and I had enough paper to hold me over for a few days anyway. I had to stand by the machine to unload the thread and reload the cellulose and loom, so I didn't really get any time to continue messing with the cave entrance, though I kept thinking about it and making a few drawings for what I had in mind. However, I soon realized that making fabric for the catamaran sails was probably going to take me the next several days to complete. I didn't know exactly how big a sail I needed to get good headway, but I guessed that a mast and sail about twice as tall as the boat is long would probably be a good ratio to start with, and probably about the same width, so that would require a sail about 9 meters by 4 meters, or 36 square meters. If the auto loom puts out about 1 square meter of fabric per hour, it's going to take me 6 days to make enough, though I might be able to cut that down to 2 if I can keep it fully loaded and run it overnight. I stopped for lunch at that point, but in spite of what I just calculated about making sails, I still wanted to work on that hatch, because the idea I had for it was kind of fun to me. So between swapping out thread reels, I cut some bamboo to make a cylindrical frame to go around the hole, and a circular hatch to slide inside it. At least I could use the scraps for cellulose as I worked, and it helped that I was already hanging out in the workshop. Because I had to divide my attentions, this took me to the end of the day to complete, at which point I loaded up the loom with extra thread, greased it up, and left it to run overnight. However, before going to bed, instead of cleaning up after myself, since I would have to do all that work again tomorrow, I took my frames out to the tunnel entrance, dug out a suitable place for them to sit, and filled them with claycrete to set overnight, though with one caveat. On the inside of the cylinder, around the edge of the hole, I used a short length of bamboo to press a series of deep grooves into the claycrete surface, according to a pattern I prepared earlier in the day. The grooves followed the pattern of a maze, symmetric on each side of the hole, and the idea was that pegs on either side of the lid would sit in these grooves, so the lid would have to be rotated, lifted, and lowered in a specific sequence to remove it. This should be an absolutely maddening exercise to anyone trying to open it, because from their perspective, the maze is obscured. They may not even know that they need to lower the lid at different points to complete the maze, or that they're even solving a maze at all. They may think it's some kind of combination lock. Because I know the solution, however, it should be much easier for me to get out, but in case I forget at some point, I wrote the solution on the back of the lid. This was hard to do by lamplight, but I got it done, washed up, had dinner, and got to bed a little late. Week 31, Day 4. I woke up a little groggy in the morning and proceeded with my morning chores. While I was out, though, I gathered extra grasses and plant materials to help me keep up with the cellulose grinding for thread. It was another long day of the same routine of grinding, spinning, and loading the loom. But in between tasks, I worked on hemming and sewing together the long swatches I made for the sails, which didn't take too long. I even went to the effort of sewing in some bamboo rings at intervals down the sail for the ropes to pass through, and to hold them to the mast, but distributing the force on the sail enough that it hopefully wouldn't rip. I then gave them a thin coat of latex and hung them out to dry for the day, but the added weight of the latex to the sails worried me a bit. In hindsight, I realized that the problem I had with the first mast snapping was probably the result of the sail being too heavy, especially when wet with rain. This cloth sail, however, should be much thinner and lighter than the woven grass/wooden ribbing junk sail that I tried to build the first time, and I was planning to beef up the mast anyway. On the topic of the catamaran, I checked on it during my lunch break, and after a few weeks of soaking in the sun and cleaning agents, I found that the vinegar had been the most effective at killing the mold in the wooden members of the boat. The ammonia less so. I then got back to work on the cellulose spinning, though in between switching reels, I had to go out and get more leaves and grasses to keep up with the demand. Not a lot of time to work on anything else until the end of the day. I'd been present with the loom for most of the day to keep up with any hitches in the mechanism, and I gave it a little extra grease before going to bed. Week 31, Day 5. When I got up in the morning, I finally had enough fabric to finish the sail. However, my work grinding cellulose wasn't over, since the whole thing that instigated this detour was that I wanted paper for my journal. So I gathered more plant material while I was out foraging during my morning chores, and while I was out, I had a look at the northern entrance to the escape tunnel complex. I considered my options, and frankly, this was probably the worst place to try to get in or out, because it was on a rocky, exposed hillside where it would be easy to see anyone coming or going from the compound below, except maybe at night. This entrance, too, was little more than a crawl space, so I was beginning to think that the risk of a third entrance to the cave complex might not have been worth the benefit of a third exit, and a poor one at that if I were being pursued. So I planned to just cover it with a grate of bamboo bars and reinforce the perimeter of the opening with claycrete. For the time being, however, I got back to base and started grinding, soaking, and pressing cellulose into paper before hanging it out to dry, making the most of my time by sewing, reinforcing, and waterproofing the sail between grinds. I finished around lunch, and decided I had enough paper to last me a while. Besides, I was getting a little fed up with that activity anyway. Instead, I got the bamboo slats I made a week or so ago, and spent some time building the new deck for the catamaran. As I got started though, I realized that I didn't really like how the slats felt on my bare feet. I was worried about getting splinters if I slipped, but more importantly, they were smooth enough that I worried about slipping overboard if the slats got wet. I decided to try something else, leaving some of the slats in place to make a strong framework, but repeatedly splitting or shaving the rest to be as thin as possible, like ribbons, to weave them into something almost like flat wicker. This took me several more hours than I was anticipating having to spend on this project, but the result was a strong, flexible decking that distributed the weight of my steps evenly across the bottom of my feet, minimizing potential damage and providing instant resistance if my feet started slipping in any given direction. At the end of the day, I mixed up some varnish and spread it all over the deck and exposed wooden components of the catamaran before it started to get dark. Week 31, Day 6. After my morning chores, I decided there was no putting it off any longer. I needed to make the new mast for the catamaran, and I had an unusual idea to help me with this. It occurred to me that the pontoons of the catamaran were basically like two small sailboats lashed together. So what if I built a mast for each one? This would firstly give me a level of redundancy in case one of the sails became damaged. I would at least have the other one to help me limp back to shore. Secondly, the masts wouldn't need to be strong enough to hold up the entire weight of the sails. Again, distributed weight. I'd been letting this idea brew in the back of my head for a while, and what I'd come up with was something like a tripod instead of a traditional mast, with cross-bracing between them like the radio tower, and tied to each other and the deck with cables. These masts were not going to break again. It wasn't going to be as aerodynamic as a traditional sailboat mast, but it wasn't like I was entering any races with this thing. So, in the morning, I went out and cut down some bamboo of appropriate length for the masts. Not that there were many stalks left long enough to do the job. That aside, however, I quickly realized that my plan to make the mast and sail twice as high as the sailboat was long was way too ambitious. I'd be worried about the boat capsizing if I made them that long. That fixed the mast size problem, but I now had way more sail material than I could use. Made the past couple of days feel like a bit of a mistake, but I knew I wouldn't let the material go to waste. In the meantime, I measured, cut, and jointed my masts before installing them on the boat, drilling holes into the logs for the mast to sit in, and tying them down with proper rigging, such that if a mast bent one way, it would have to pull on the other to do so, not to mention pulling on the opposite side of the boat. I stopped for lunch, and then began working on the rigging, mostly reusing the pulleys I'd already made and repaired, but also making a few new ones. I also cut and tied on the booms to help control the sails, and it was easy to integrate into the ratcheting system so that both booms remained parallel to each other under normal sailing conditions, though I recognized I could also make them both splay out to the sides, almost like wings, when the wind is at my back. It made for a somewhat complicated spider web of cords and ropes, but in the midst of that, I quickly found an alternative use for some of the rubberized cloth I made. By simply draping it across a cable tied between the masts, I was able to make a sort of tent to keep the sun and rain off of me. No need to bother with that little pup tent at the back of the boat anymore. I'll be sailing in style. I noticed I was actually getting a little excited about sailing again, designing and planning as though I was going to take this thing on a long sea voyage, even though I pretty much have no intention of doing so right now. I then cut and re-hemmed the sails to match the height of the masts I built, keeping some in reserve for the little tent. I even rigged up some of those mini sails that go in front of the masts, which were already catching quite a bit of wind. Even after all that, I still had plenty of cloth left over. Concluding that I'd more or less finished rebuilding the ship, I spent the remainder of the evening varnishing the masts, booms, and mechanical components so that no part of the catamaran's surface could be exposed to water again. I worked a bit into the night on this before getting to bed late, pleased that I'd brought this project more or less to a close. Week 31, Day 7. It's Sabbath again. Another week seems to have flown by. I did my morning chores and had my typical restful morning transcribing my radio recordings and listening to the sermon. It occurred to me, though, that the catamaran project still wasn't technically finished. There was still one thing left to do before I could consider it done, and that was to conquer my fear and take it out on the water. At least it was a calm day today with a light breeze, so it wouldn't be nearly as bad as the first time. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I loaded up the boat with the cooking, desalinating, and fishing equipment I kept in storage since the day I hid it, along with a little food and water, just in case something went really wrong and I got swept out to sea or something. I even brought my survey equipment with me, as I considered doing some experiments on oceanic navigation. I yanked and shook as hard as I could on as many things as I could, just to make sure they wouldn't spontaneously collapse on me in the middle of the ocean before, finding myself with no excuse, gathering my courage, and rolling the boat back out into the water. I raised the sails with trepidation at first, merely using the little front sails to lightly tow the ship away from the island, though I was still very much hugging the shore. I then unfurled the mainsails and started to pick up speed, traveling around and around the island in a spiral, getting a little further away each time. This was good practice for me, switching the positions of the sails to push the boat in a single direction, regardless of the direction of the wind, especially when I needed to tack into it. I felt like I was starting to get the hang of it when I came back to shore for lunch, still not wanting to overstay my welcome on the open ocean. Nevertheless, I felt like I'd conquered my fear for the most part, and as I was eating, I recognized that the boat still needed a few more touches before I could consider it truly finished. Firstly, I knew I'd feel more comfortable if there were some safety rails around the perimeter. So after lunch, I quickly knocked some safety rails together using rope and a few bamboo posts, having a little fun with it by making a zigzag pattern for the vertical cables. And secondly, I decided to give it a name. After all the trouble it's put me through, I'm starting to get attached to it now. Inspired by the crisscrossing of cables all over it, I decided to call it the Mizegumo, which means water spider in Japanese. Thanks again to the Mythbusters for that piece of useless trivia. This is technically a misnomer because the name refers to a diving spider, but I don't know enough Japanese to call it the water web or something silly like that. With the name selected, I decided to have a little artistic fun with it as well, getting some charcoal, mixing it with a little rubber, and painting a spider motif on one side of either of the sails, such that you should only see one spider on it at a time, regardless of the angle the boat is viewed from. I painted some long, thin arcs on the sail as well, to make a pattern vaguely resembling a funnel or sheet web, as opposed to the classic orb web, and it looked pretty cool. Just to be extra safe, I spent the remainder of the evening putting on one more coat of varnish, making sure that the surfaces were cleaned of salt and dry before applying. This time it was not going to rot. Besides, now that I have an idea of which day the smugglers will be coming, and probably at least an hour's notice before they arrive thanks to my hydrophone, I'll be able to keep the Mizegumo near my base all the time, where it can be exposed to the air and sun all day, hiding it in the mangrove swamp only for as long as I need to.
Blooper reel, blooper reel, does whatever a blooper reel does. As I test of the, I thought I went through this and fixed all the typos. Pause. And started filling in the framework surrounding the turntable and started filling in the framework surrounding the turntable as planned. And started filling in the without which the structure would be hard to say. Without which the structure will be prone to cracking and crumbling. Without which the structure will be The buzzing soon grove. This should be an absolutely maddening exercise to anyone trying to open it. From anyone trying to open it. To anyone trying to open it. Though in between switching reels, excuse me. Though in between switching reels, I had to go out and get more leaves and grasses to keep up with the demand. Excuse me. So I was beginning to think that the risk of a third entrance to the cave complex might not have been worth the benefit. Pause. I got back to base and started grinding, soaking, and pressing cellulose into paper before hanging it out to dry. Please that I, before getting to bed late, I yanked and shook as hard, and painting a spider motif on it, and painting a spider tee, and as opposed to the classic orb web, as opposed to Besides, I was getting a little fed up with that activity anyway. This is why you don't eat before recording. Hey there, thanks for listening all the way to the end. It feels good to have my defenses mostly finished, and to be able to hear the smugglers coming and have the option to make a break for it if I need to. However, I have no intentions of abandoning my island just yet, and in fact, fixing the catamaran has given me some ideas for one more area that I haven't explored yet. So, if you'd like to find out what I make next, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as they're ready. Now, I still haven't figured out why no one seems to be able to pick up my radio messages, except you, but if you could, it would help me out more than anything else if you could share these videos with someone who you think would enjoy them. And since you apparently enjoyed this one enough to watch it to the end, you can press the like button to say so, and to hopefully get the YouTube algorithm to do a little bit of that sharing for you. Also, if you'd like to chat about your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe about some of your experiences boating, or conquering your fears, please feel free to share them in the comments section below. To pull back the curtain a little bit, the catamaran is sort of an imperfect analogy for my social experience, trying to get out of my head, my island, and make friends, but doing it the normal way kept causing me to wreck, and made me too scared and hurt to try again. So now I'm trying it my way, the weird way, though I'm still a bit nervous about it. Let me know how I'm doing. So far, your comments have been pretty nice. I genuinely look forward to getting them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.